From the Virginia Audio Collective at WTJU 91.1 FM and Brown College at the University of Virginia, this is Circle of Willis, human stories of the science that shapes our world.
I don't never really know what to tell people about frontal EEG asymmetry. These days I punt and say, well, there's this interesting pattern of activity.
Right.
It's your prefrontal cortex. Where is that? Well, I put my forehead, I put my palm on my forehead and go.
As if to say, don't.
Yeah, right. It's right here, and it's a pattern right here, and that pattern tells me whether or not you're going to be depressed. Really? Not really. Not really,
Yeah,
but we hope.
What's the sensitivity? What's the specificity?
We think so. Yeah, right. Like you're going to tell them about that.
Yeah. What year will you get depressed? Yeah.
At least one methodologist on Facebook has said to me, yeah, we should have abandoned that 20 years ago. So, that's what people think about this.
It's got its detractors.
Yep.
Welcome back to Circle of Willis. I'm your host, Jim Cohn, and I'm joined by my producer, Sage Tangway.
Hello. So, frontal EEG asymmetry. I know you were just saying in that clip that you don't know how to describe it, but I did a Google search and literally the top article was written by you and this episode's guest, John Allen. So for me and the rest of your non-neuroscientist listeners, let's try to break this down a little bit. What does EEG stand for?
It stands for electroencephalogram. It's a measure of the electrical activity in the brain. It's like brain waves, you've probably heard that word. We measure it by attaching electrodes all over the scalp.
So this is like that old National Geographic cover with the Tibetan monk. Or for a more modern reference, like what Eleven is hooked up to on Stranger Things as she uses her telekinesis.
Yeah, it's like that. And in fact, that Tibetan monk picture from the National Geographic cover was taken at Richie Davidson's lab in Wisconsin while I was there. So it's all very... I don't know.
Perfect.
Is incestuous the right word? That's what we're using. We're using that kind of measuring device to get these brain waves, these electrical waves emanating from the brain itself, but are only recordable, capturable at the scalp. As for the asymmetry we're talking about, there's this idea that goes back to the 70s that the two most basic behaviors that a critter can engage in are move toward a thing or move away from a thing.
Okay.
That's approach and withdraw or avoid. Richie Davidson and Nathan Fox came up with this model that suggested that when you were approaching things, there was this pattern of relatively greater left prefrontal activity. And when you were withdrawing from things, it was a pattern of relatively greater right prefrontal activity. Richie then associated this with risk for anxiety disorders and depression.
Okay.
And that caught people's attention because the holy grail of psychiatry and clinical psychology for decades has been to find the neural mechanisms of these mental disorders, these psychological disorders, so that we can create some kind of, physiological medication-based lever that can just turn it off.
Right. Well, I'm sure that unlike Stranger Things, this has nothing to do with using psychic children in Cold War efforts, but it still sounds like there's a little bit of controversy. Let's listen back to the interview. You somewhat valiantly tried to get John to nail down a clear definition of this method, but no such luck.
When I was going on to set up my lab after going to grad school with you, I was nervous. I was really nervous because I thought I was going to go into set up my lab and I was going to be doing this frontal EEG asymmetry stuff, and I had no idea what it meant still after all this time. Even after the big review paper that we did, I was like, oh my God, I don't really, is this even approach and withdraw? I don't, how do you even describe it?
Right. It even presumes it's one thing.
Right. I mean, I guess so.
Mm-hmm. At the broadest sense, right, is it something that characterizes an individual over time in a stable way? And if so, what does that mean about the individual? Is it a tendency that they're going to act in a particular way, or is it a capacity that when confronted with a certain situation, they're going to respond in a particular way?
Yeah.
Of course, then it's also something that, has not just this trait-like quality, it's got this ability to move around with response to our emotions, So I think It's not a unidimensional construct.
God, that hurts. God, I don't even want to think about that.
That's tough.
I think this is a really important part of Circle of Willis. Sometimes this show tries to demystify science for people who aren't in the field, but other times it shows how mystified the actual researchers still are, even when they've studied something extensively, or maybe because they've done so.
Yeah, John and I have been in the weeds with this for a long time. And so by this time, we sort of share a brain. And it's one of those things like couples where they finish each other's sentences and nobody else knows what in the hell's going on. John and I have that. And so I'm trying to get us to be a little slower and more explicit, but it's a struggle. The fact that John and I have spent so much time thinking deeply about this problem is why I wanted to do this interview. So there's a lot going on here. Now, in addition to that, John's personal story is a perfect example for me of how scientific research builds from momentum. That sometimes the path of becoming a scientist or to what you dedicate your research can be fairly indirect and winding. It's a lot of wandering around in the dark.
Let's take a listen.
It was in the earlier half of the 80s. So
Yeah.
I was an undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin. My dad was a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and
In what?
in communication arts education. So he
didn't know that.
taught public speaking, he coached debate, and he wrote books on
Jesus.
how to teach people how to teach people how to teach people
How to teach
language.
people how to... That's too many elephants down.
Yeah, so he wrote books for high school teachers on the language arts and for elementary school teachers on the language arts and even for college teachers on the language arts.
See, Dad was a professor at UW.
We call it UW.
And your mom?
And my mom was an elementary education major and taught first graders for a year. And I don't think she enjoyed it as much as she wanted to. And then she worked in offices, in secretarial positions, and then was a full-time mom for the years that both me and my brother were under kindergarten age.
Your older brother?
My younger brother. He's almost 6 years younger. So
6
for
years.
about a span of then 11 years, she was just, full into raising the kids.
Wow.
And then she went back into the school system under one of the title number programs to help kids with special needs and tutoring and things like that.
Cool.
But all along, she was editing and typing my dad's books. So this is before computers. This is before word processors. And my dad would write the books on a yellow pad.
Like in script?
On a yellow pad with scratching out lines and arrows and circles and
Yeah.
drawing, and go to A, and A is 3 pages down. And there's my mom with her old manual Hermes typewriter. And you could hear it down in the kitchen.
Oh my God, you're kidding.
Yep, and you have to hit the carriage return at the end of the line, so you don't keep typing off the edge of the page. And,
Yeah.
if you make a mistake, you have to get out the liquid white paper and put it on, and then wait for it to dry. Yep. So
Wow.
yeah, so yeah, that's where they were. And when school was out, I would go into Madison often with my dad and hang out on campus.
So you knew the campus there really well.
Well, I knew the campus from the vantage point of a 12 to 14-year-old boy who would go climb around in the rafters of the studio where the local radio station was. And
When I was a kid, friends of mine and I would sometimes go down into the heat tunnels underneath at Washington State University down in Pullman, break into buildings and things like that. But so you didn't decide to go someplace else? You wanted to stay in town and go?
This is
You never thought about going
I applied
to-
to college one place. I don't think at that time.
You just only applied to the University of Wisconsin?
Yeah.
Hey, that's cool.
Yeah, I applied there, and it was affordable. I didn't think that much about where I applied, and I really didn't think that much about what college was about. So I just rolled on into college and was at college. But I was simultaneously working over 30 hours a week as a swing manager at McDonald's. That's the official term.
Oh, yeah,
it
yeah.
didn't denote a lifestyle.
Oh, right.
It
Yes,
denoted,
of course.
You'd swing shifts. You'd do different shifts, right?
Sadly.
Yeah, right. It
Yeah.
could have been much more
Could have been
exciting.
much more interesting. When did you start managing McDonald's?
The day I turned 18, 2 weeks later. Then
That's a responsible position for an 18-year-old. I knew that you had done work at McDonald's, but I didn't realize that you were that young at
Yes.
the point where you're managing.
That was actually occupying a good amount of my time and my attention. Plus, a good friend from going back into elementary school had a band. And they had some sound equipment. And this interested me greatly. And so I started doing sound mixing for his band. His guitar player, Lenny.
Lenny?
Lenny, well, Lenny's name was Mark, but his last name was
Lenny's a better band
Was
name.
Len something with a ski on the end.
Yeah,
So he just
it's
got called Lenny.
much better.
Yeah. So Lenny showed me a few things, and from there I just took off and
Wow.
eventually bought my own board. 16,
You did?
16 channels? Kelsey Pro 3 mixer.
Wow.
Yeah. And
That's an expensive piece of equipment.
well, it is. I bought it with the settlement from a motorcycle accident.
So motorcycle accident pre or post 18?
Post 18.
So you're managing at McDonald's.
So
you're going to school at UW. You get in a motorcycle accident. What happened?
So back before Ticketmaster had any online presence, because there was no online presence, you'd go to Ticketmaster to get your tickets, and it was at the Sears store. So I was riding my motorcycle around the periphery of the Easttown Mall, going to get tickets for REO Speedwagon, which should have been a clue that this was a bad idea in the first place.
That I loved you forever. Yeah. Got
It's
it.
time for me to fly.
Yeah.
I've been around for you. I've been up and down for you. I can't get any relief. A 60-something woman and her 80-something-year-old mother who pulled out from a yield sign. I wasn't experienced enough on the motorcycle. I couldn't stop. I clipped their bumper and I went flying off. Broke a collarbone,
man.
but I was fine. I was wearing a helmet. And
Broke your collarbone doesn't count as fine for me.
well, okay. So my head was fine.
Your head was fine.
My head
Good.
was fine. I was fine enough to string a series of expletives together to scream at the
That's good.
65-year-old lady.
Nice. That's good. And not many people have necessarily done that. You saw your opportunity and you took it.
I took I guess God struck me down with her and sent some guardian angel to come whisk me off to the side, a bicyclist, and the woman sat with me until the ambulance came.
So it's good because you got your settlement and
Got my
you
settlement,
bought a soundboard.
Bought my soundboard, and then I was at that point too busy to think about going back to school. So
you dropped out?
I finished my spring semester, so I had I was in good standing, and I just didn't return, which, as you might imagine, wasn't particularly popular with a professor father. Yeah.
Right. I mean, did they pressure you?
Well, not overtly,
Yeah.
but it was
They
clear.
did it the Midwestern way.
Yes.
Oh, well, that's okay, I guess.
It's like,
I'll just sit over here and read.
yeah. Yeah, it's not quite, don't worry about me, I'll sit in the dark, but it's
It's something along those lines.
along those lines.
So you
It's
took
like,
some
well,
time.
one of these days, I'm sure you'll get your life together. So I took some time off, and I did sound, and McDonald's worked fine for me. I got promoted to salaried manager position, second assistant, first assistant, and as part of this, they enroll you in what's known as Hamburger
University.
And I went through basic operations course. I went through intermediate operations course. And at this point, a couple years in, and a couple years out of school, and a couple years into this program, working most of the time just in the store, but going to these, weekend and week-long courses, they started talking about my career development. And that just sent a shiver down my spine.
Because what do they mean by that?
Well, they mean thinking about, what's your trajectory within the McDonald's corporation?
How high are you going to go?
How high are you going to go? So you can be your store manager, and then you can be a supervisor for multiple stores, and then there's routes for,
So right now you could be like on the corporate board for McDonald's, in theory.
If I hadn't died of a heart attack from eating all the food.
All the food.
Right. But anyway, they started talking about my career development, and I realized I had never thought of this as a career, and it ultimately wasn't that satisfying. Plus, doing sound with bands and getting home late, and then sometimes having a shift that started at 4 or 5 in the morning to do inventory or month-end stuff.
Oh man,
I almost got fired
with bands. That would be a
I almost got
tough
fired because
combination.
I was late a few times.
Oh yeah.
And then the store couldn't open. So
Yeah.
So at that point, I decided I'd go back to school in McDonald's. Part of this Hamburger University is you could get your degree through the Oak Brook accredited program. You could also, though, get credit from regular universities towards this. And so I told them I'd like to go back to the University of Wisconsin. And since I left in good standing, I could come back. And so the first semester, I looked at what would be interesting, and I saw psychology sounded kind of interesting. Now, when I was there before, I was taking calculus and computer science and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And philosophy, general ed stuff. And then I thought, well, psychology sounds good. And they had one that was at 5 in the afternoon. So I could go no matter what shift I worked, unless I was working the closing shift at McDonald's.
They had a what at 5 in the afternoon?
Introduction to Psychology course.
Wow.
A 500-person course.
That's great.
At 5 in the afternoon.
Because that would never happen at UVA. There would never be an introductory course at 5 in the afternoon.
It was a huge lecture hall, 500 plus people, and I had the good fortune of being taught by Steve Sumi. who's
You're
a primate
kidding.
researcher. You know Steve Sumi?
Of course.
Yeah. He's
He
phenomenal.
was teaching introductory psychology.
Teaching intro psychology. So
Jesus
this was before
Christ.
people knew the word biopsychosocial perspective, but he was
this,
showing
that.
us the
That's what he was.
biopsychosocial perspective because of his work
Yeah.
with primates at all levels.
Oh,
yeah.
for God's sake.
And I thought, oh, this is good. I should do this for a major. And that started me down the
that
path.
was a charmed beginning.
That was a stroke of pure good luck.
Yeah.
It really was. And that set me down this career path. So that gets us back, now that we've had that little side tour, to the story of EEG Asymmetry, which is
like
to
an
Madison,
imponderably obtuse.
which might be why the interview is imponderably.
That's why we're wandering around. So EEG Asymmetry, you encountered this as an undergraduate.
I had been working with the Chapmans, Lauren and Jean Chapman, studying risk for psychosis. And while I was there, they hired a new faculty member, Richie Davidson. And so when I was first working in Lauren's lab, I think in 83 or 84, Richie wasn't there, and Richie came there in 85. In fact, this was another stroke of good luck. I delayed my graduation by a year. I was in such a hurry to get out. You know, you get back to school, you're older than the other students. I want to get through. I want to get out.
Look at these kids.
I'm 3 years
these
older
kids
than these kids. But then, Lauren was talking to me, Lauren Chapman, and I realized, I can take some extra courses. Lauren let me take one of his graduate courses.
So Richie shows up. In a blaze of glory, no doubt, right?
Well,
blaze of fireworks.
The cartoon image
a
of
blaze.
Richie is that as he walks down the hall, there's a blur behind him because he walks so fast. And
does.
Everywhere he went, he walked with purpose.
Yes,
right?
he does.
Before
he could knock down brick walls.
Before people talked about being mindful, there was purpose. And Richie walked with purpose. And he walked to his office with purpose. And he walked to his lab with purpose. And there he was. And he had so much energy and so much enthusiasm. But really what got me, I was sitting there in Lauren's lab, and they start moving in all of this stuff to his lab. My lab had piles of paper. And number stamps so that you could stamp the questionnaires, each with its own number, and the number stamp would automatically advance. That was high tech for my lab. And Richie's lab had knobs and buttons and wires.
And that stuff is intoxicating.
It was like,
I love that crap.
Like being a teenage boy, and the guy next door brings a hot car and opens the hood. It's like, I got to go take a look at
that.
So I went over and I started talking to Cliff Sarin.
Cliff!
He was with Richie at SUNY Purchase, and I don't know if he was with Richie before then, but anyway, I went over and Cliff shows me the lab, and he says, hey, we're setting it up, we need to pilot it out, you want to try it? And so I got my EEG recorded and never did get any results, but
just right on the spot, you got EEG recorded
the next
from
day
you?
I came back and he hooked me up and showed me some.
And what kind of system did they have then? What were they recording EEG with?
I think they had a Grass polygraph, and there was a ton of Coburn equipment in there.
Spools of paper. It wasn't recording into a computer system, right?
Paper was really not so useful. So the outputs, the little small voltage outputs from each amplifier, each of those wires would go into a Coburn module and feed into another Coburn module, and each Coburn module was like a function that we would use now in MATLAB. So they would filter the data, they would integrate the data, they would rectify the data.
They were running it through multiple filters.
Yes, and then
online.
I think it came out on little strips of paper. So you get things like alpha power or alpha power density on this little strip of paper over time.
Because now we run all these like spectral analyses and FFTs and things. You wouldn't be able to do that.
No. I think they filtered, bandpass filtered it.
Bandpass filtered.
So you got 8 to 13 hertz. And then you could integrate and rectify it.
And then they just measure the
amplitude.
The amplitudes.
Yeah.
Christ.
Right.
Wow.
So since I was there a fifth year and I was working in the lab, I got to know a lot of the graduate students, and they were all just saying, oh my God, Richie's going to be teaching this psychophysiology course. And I'm thinking, wow, that sounds psychophysiology.
That's pretty amazing.
That's better than ordinary physiology. It's psychophysiology. And so I camped out at Richie's door and I said, hey, I'm really, pulled out the Lauren card. I work with Lauren Chapman. And it would be really good if I could take this course. And he hemmed and hawed a bit, and he didn't know who I was. But sure enough, my persistence, and I don't know if any help from Lauren was involved, but I got to take his course. I think I was the only undergraduate who got to take this course.
So Lauren twisted Richie's arm? Or?
I don't know that he did, but I can't imagine that Richie would have just seen me, not known me from Adam, and just let me into this course because it was already overloaded. We packed this room. We were way overbooked for this room.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was, it's a big class, and psychophysiology has a lab component that Andy Tamarkin and Marie Balaban ran.
Wow.
Yeah.
These names, these names exist for me in this literature, that I've been reading forever.
They're real people.
I know. That's the thing about science, is that you read enough of the literature and you read enough of one person's papers, and they invariably become kind of celebrities to you.
Yes.
I get tongue-tied.
Right. And then you meet them, you go, oh, I thought you were like 7 feet tall and 65 years old.
Yeah. Right.
Right. But that's where I first encountered it. And then, I didn't think at that point I'd be a frontal EEG asymmetry researcher, but I went off to graduate school with the idea that I would use psychophysiological measures to try to index risk for psychopathology, including, and maybe most focused on, schizophrenia.
Oh,
because
so you
of
were
the work,
really, because of Lauren.
Exactly. I was fascinated with schizophrenia. It's just a devastating disorder. It's got, symptoms that are really hard to wrap your head around. And, at this time, we understood there was a genetic basis, but, we hadn't mapped the human genome. We didn't understand all these complexities. So we were trying to tackle it from kind of a psychological and psychophysiological perspective.
Yeah.
So I applied to programs where this would be an option, and I ended up going to the University of Minnesota and worked with Bill Iacono. And although I worked on some of his schizophrenia data, that's not where I spent most of my time. I got interested in doing other things, and we had a chance to study seasonal affective disorder because Minneapolis is a good long way from the equator, and they have a really short winter day. Yeah. And during the short winter day, people who are at risk get seasonal affective disorder. Bill was great as an advisor because he didn't have anything that I had to do. He wanted me to do things that, were scientifically interesting and meaningful to me, and he supported me in them. And so we got into some of the work on seasonal affective disorder, where I brought in my interest in frontal EEG asymmetry.
You did EEG. So he had an EEG system there already.
Yeah, we had 4 channels.
4 channels. Yeah. God. You guys. So
we were living large.
Yeah. Uh-huh. And you found that people who were at risk for seasonal affective disorder showed a pattern of relatively greater right frontal activity.
That would be the inference.
That'd be the inference,
right.
Because what you really find, this is where it becomes so impossible at parties. What it really is they show less alpha over the right frontal cortex, meaning more activity over the right frontal cortex.
Right. Relative
to the left.
Yes.
It just goes on and on. It never stops.
The reason we say the inference is at risk is because we got them in the depth of their episode the first week of January when they're seriously depressed, before they started bright light treatment. We got them again 3 weeks later after 3 weeks of bright light treatment. So symptomatically at the beginning, they're clinically depressed, and symptomatically 3 weeks later, they're in remission.
Yeah.
I mean, the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale scores are down in the range under 5.
Oh, my God.
I mean, it's not just a response, it's remission. Yeah, this is an interesting commentary for psychological and psychiatric intervention. Most of the time we get responses, but we don't often get remission. And with seasonal affective disorder, since it's a fairly, circumscribed,
it's a perfect thing to study, really.
Right. So we have people in episode, we have people out of episode, separated by 3 weeks. We get EEG asymmetry at both times, and we have seasonal affective disorder patients and matched controls.
Yeah.
And we find that at both times, the seasonal affective disorder patients differ from the controls.
Okay.
So it's not state dependent.
Right.
It seems to be
it's
a characteristic of the person.
It's a risk marker,
right?
Perhaps, potentially.
Potentially a risk marker. I mean, nobody's really investigated carefully. Is it a residual scar of having had depression?
Right.
So that depression
you
reorganizes.
Do the prospective thing that's so hard to do.
You listening, NIH?
Come on, NIH. Settle the question, for crying out loud.
Yeah.
So you didn't know for sure it was a marker, but it was definitely associated with this risk.
Yeah. It was a promising marker. We'd say a promising marker of risk. That was my master's study.
That was your master's study. Maybe not for you, but this happens I see this so much that people's masters is like, wow, and then their dissertation, they're like,
your dissertation's now in version 3.0 or 4.0, still dealing with Minnesota twin data. We just have different players coming in and working on it. No, my dissertation was using event-related potentials as an index of memory that doesn't depend on people telling us they remember something, like a lie detection protocol.
Okay.
Applying it to studying post-hypnotic recognition amnesia. So I hypnotized lots of people.
That's weird.
I know. I hypnotized 800 people and maybe 100 responded.
Really?
Well, it's an individual difference. Hypnotizability is an individual difference, and
suggestibility.
Well, waking suggestibility is correlated with hypnotic suggestibility,
Yeah.
but they're not synonymous constructs.
Yeah.
And it's not
Somehow I've
gullibility.
gotten all through my career and I still don't understand hypnosis very well.
I think the field ultimately came to that. You know, it was a really hot topic in the 80s, which is when I was doing my dissertation research. And the field, I think, got to the same point of like, well, okay, some of the effects are real. They're not just demand characteristics, and it's certainly not stage hypnosis. And, you know, it can be useful for pain mitigation and altering perception and helping focus study skills. But I think theoretically people just burned out on it because of the question of at what level are we trying to explain it? What's the theoretical question? And so, you know, like many topics, it rises on a wave and then it disappeared.
That's a thing.
Yeah.
Well, that's part of why I'm still grudgingly fascinated with EEG asymmetry.
It has survived.
It has somehow, it's still here.
Yes.
It's still
and, you know,
here.
part of the reason, and this isn't a good reason, is that it got mapped almost in a one-to-one monolithic fashion that approach is relative left frontal and withdrawal is relative right frontal. And, you know, as a spokesperson for the field, when Ritchie came out with that theoretical perspective, at the time it was, I think, a reasonable perspective, but it became so easy for people now to treat EEG asymmetry as synonymous with this psychological construct. And a fairly broad psychological construct at that. And what is approach? What is withdraw? And is it context specific? And there were all kinds of questions that people could have worked on.
But it solves the party problem.
It does.
It solves it. You know. So here's the thing: if you're this way, you do that, and if you're that way, you do this. People love the different hemisphere.
Yes.
You know, are you right-brained or left-brained kind of thing?
Yes.
That's an easier explanation than frontal EEG asymmetry, and we don't really know what it means, but it might put you at risk for bad things.
Yes. Although, on the other hand, I'm quite reluctant to start going down the path of right brain, left brain with people because it makes it sound like...
No, I don't go anywhere near that.
Yeah. Yeah.
You went to Arizona and got a big, new, shiny EEG system.
I did. I had 32 channels.
32 channels. That's amazing.
It wasn't even the standard GRASS polygraph because I think they had a 16-channel.
I remember
model.
that thing.
Yeah, it still sits there.
Set it up the thing with the...
Remember, you and I would...
The plastic stick.
Yep.
Whatever that...
Selector.
The
selector stick.
I'm glad it had a name. And it's alarming that I'm only now learning what the name of it was.
It was the
I just knew it was the thing that you pushed the stuff in to make the brain go. That's the extent of my...
Do you remember you and I taking in each of the 32 amplifiers out, blowing compressed air across the contacts, hooking it up to an oscilloscope, and then we calibrated it. We had to calibrate, first of all, the mean offset, and then the amplitude, then go back to the mean offset, then back to the amplitude, until that thing was centered on zero, and that 5 volts plus and minus really looked like 5 volts.
That's when the teenage shiny stuff under the hood stuff comes crashing back down to earth. The reality is you got to pay a lot of attention to a lot of very minuscule little aggravating details.
Yes. I think I had to use...
You have a much better temperament for that than I do.
I think I just motivated you with tacos and beer.
We
do this
always what
we
works.
Get tacos and beer.
That is the thing that works. My grad students even know that.
Yeah.
Tacos and beer. Really want something done. Yeah. So you got the
I got the shiny system.
You got the shiny system, the best awesome system, 32 channels, not
great.
Simple 4 channels of crap. This is the real deal.
This is the real deal. Yep. And,
yeah.
And it digitized.
And it's digitized. It's recording onto hard drives.
Yep. This was the first time that there was not an analog backup. Everything had done in the lab.
An analog backup meaning paper?
Tape.
Tape.
It was a
magnetic tape?
It was a special tape recorder that, in addition to I think it was 4 or 8 tracks, so each one was a channel of psychophysiology, it had a special calibration track. And this put in a known signal. And so at playback, if there was any deviation in the frequency of that known signal, it would know to slow down or speed up to compensate.
Really?
Because, tapes would stretch.
Yeah.
Right? So you imagine you got your psychophysiology data.
Wow.
Your EEG data. You're counting on millisecond precision.
Yeah.
And now your tape stretches.
Oh, forget it.
Right? You'd be toast. So this calibration track was in there. And it was interesting because one time I put the tape in backwards, got to listen to the calibration track, and it was like something out of an old, horror movie. It's like,
So, but
this
you
was
didn't use this then.
No,
you didn't use the.
I digitized and
That was ballsy.
well, I digitized at a high sample rate with wide open filters, figuring, okay, that way this is as close to that analog tape recording as possible.
Yeah. You're gonna deal with all the filtering and stuff on the back end.
Networks didn't exist, so we had worm drives.
Worm drives. So when is this? This is 93?
1992, 93.
92?
And worm drives were write once,
Yeah.
read many.
I see. At that time, I was working in the Gottman lab up in Seattle, and we had these big, giant Bernoulli drives that were...
Yes.
I can't even remember how that... It seems that they're absurdly small.
Yes.
But they were huge.
They were too small for the EEG. That's why I got the worm drives.
Yeah, I see.
Now, a few years later, we could write CDs, but this was the technology at the time.
Yeah, the CDs didn't happen until I had been there for a while.
97, and I don't think writable CDs were available till even closer to 2000, at least not routinely.
Yeah.
And
Isn't that incredible?
yeah. And now you just...
I remember at the University of Washington, there was one place in the hospital that had this special machine where you could write a CD. And it was incredible. And you'd have to reserve it in the middle of the night. You go up there at 10 o'clock at night, and I'd come in with my Bernoulli drives. And I'd plug the Bernoulli drives into the cartridge holder and burn the CD. And just, I was about to beam up to the Enterprise, man.
Your whole career has a history of going into places with technology late at night.
Yeah, I know. Because that's what it is. That's what this life is.
There is a part of being a scientist,
Those
right?
of you not sure whether you're going to do it.
Right. When that equipment's not being used during the day, then we can go futz with it and set it up for our purposes and bring our drills and run
when
our
it's
cables.
when it's not doing useful things, we're going to make it do things that might hopefully be useful someday that you can't tell.
With a little luck.
Yeah. Okay, so you're there and you start doing. Were you intending to do more EEG asymmetry work at that point?
It wasn't first and foremost on my mind. No, I started out when I first got there. I was continuing to do some work with ERPs and memory. And
event-related potentials.
Event-related brain potentials in memory.
Yeah.
The kind of lie detector work. I was doing some...
monitoring how the brain responds to things.
Yeah. I started doing hypnosis screening, and it was fortunate John Kilstrom was there at the time, and he was also interested in hypnosis, so some of his
Wasn't
research...
he sort of interested in debunking it in some way?
Well, I think... he and I were of a like mind that there's a real phenomenon there, but we need to kind of understand what it is and what the mechanisms are and what the limits are, and make sure it's not demand characteristics and so on.
Yeah.
And ultimately how phenomena like dissociation may relate to hypnotizability. And I'm not talking about the controversy about things like dissociative identity disorder, but think of the normal range of dissociation that people can experience.
Yeah.
So we started doing hypnosis screening, and I did some studies. Those were a lot of effort, and ultimately I got more interested in doing work again on depression. There was the call for proposals from the Office of Alternative Medicine.
Okay. That was there then?
That came out in the spring of 93.
Oh, I didn't know that. I thought that came much later.
No, that was the end of my first year as a faculty member, and the spouse of the first student I admitted, David Schneier was my first student.
Oh, and
Rosa Schneier. She was an acupuncturist, and we were having lots of conversations of what is acupuncture, what does it do? And I said, we're thinking it would be fun to, bring people in and put needles in them and look at the evoked response. I was thinking about something like, could we do pain modulation, deliver acupuncture in real points, fake points, and just do something simple like that. And then this call came out to look at alternative treatments, and they were specifically designed to foster collaboration between conventional researchers and practitioners of alternative medicine.
Okay.
And I showed this to Rosa, and she got very excited, and I got excited. And we realized pretty quickly we needed to do something useful, so we thought about a treatment trial for depression. And then I realized I went to Minnesota. I learned nothing about treatment. It was the best graduate education for understanding psychopathology and risk for psychopathology and methods and behavioral genetics and psychophysiology. Yeah. And I had a toolbox, and I could attack any problem except studying interventions.
Got it.
So I went down and on Varda's door, I said, "Hey, Varda,
really?
You know something about interventions?"
Yeah.
Varda shares her grant with me. Varda starts meeting with me and Rosa. I had a 3-month postdoc with Varda.
Unbelievable.
She
I didn't
was
know
like
this.
I didn't have an official postdoc, but if I had to say on my academic history, I had a postdoc with Varda for 3 months while Rosa and I designed that study.
I'll be damned.
And
I didn't know that.
She was a damn good postdoc advisor. We got the grant, and we were able to study acupuncture as a treatment for depression. And that's a whole story unto itself. But it got me back into bringing psychophysiology in to study people with major depression.
And what psychophysiology did you apply the asymmetry measure? That's how that was the doorway back into that.
That was the doorway
measure?
back in. So we had depressed patients coming in. They were going to be coming in for either 3 sessions across 2 months or 5 sessions across 4 months. So in other words, they'd go pre, and then after a month get an assessment, after a month get an assessment. Some of the patients went for 2 months and some went for 4 months. So we had 38 women, and they were assessed either 3 or 5 times each.
Yeah.
We had a negligible dropout rate. So I had a very clear data set, no control group, but a very good opportunity to look at the stability of EEG asymmetry over time.
Nice. That's
a theme
good.
in
so
the
another
research.
theme,
The extent
Is this a reliable phenomenon?
Is it a reliable phenomenon? We could look at internal consistency. We looked at temporal stability. We looked at temporal stability despite changes in symptoms. We looked at whether, to the extent that there are changes in asymmetry, are those changes related to changes in symptoms? About 60% of the variance is stable trait variance. To the extent that it changes session to session.
You found that then?
Yeah. Well, I analyzed that part years later. But
got it.
To the extent that asymmetry changes and symptoms change, those two changes are unrelated.
Wow.
So it's not that asymmetry just, is part of the response of getting well.
So this is like 94.
Well, we got the grant in 94, completed in 96, yeah.
Yeah. I remember at that time just starting to read Richie's papers before I applied to go to graduate school at Arizona.
Because
Richie
you arrived
was
in
one
the
of the
fall
people
of 96,
that I applied to. Yeah,
right?
that's
We were finishing up recruitment on that study.
Yeah. And, I was at that time, as you remember, I don't know what I was interested in. I was out of my mind. I
recall you were interested in everything.
I was interested in everything and out of my mind. But I remember the main thing that I was interested in is emotion and emotional expressions and so in addition to this EEG asymmetry is serving as a potential marker of risk for things like seasonal affective disorder or depression, or a marker of recovery, or a prognostic indicator, whatever it is.
Yeah.
In some kind of trait-like fashion. But the idea that it gave us an index of the motivational properties of different emotions. It really gave me this feeling that motivation and valence were two separate axes, and it seems obvious now, but I'd never really thought of it before.
Right.
That joy and anger looked more similar with this metric of EEG asymmetry than anger and sadness or anger and fear did.
Right.
That blew my mind. It taught me all kinds of things, like instantaneously, like a thunderclap about anger.
Right. And also, I don't know about you, but it made me think, once again, introspection may not be the best route for scientific knowledge.
Yep.
Right? It's like introspectively, you think, all of these emotional states tell me I want to terminate them.
Yeah.
Right? I want to get rid of them. I don't want them to be prolonged.
Yep.
And, amusement, contentment, happiness, joy,
that's fine.
Let's keep that going, right?
Yeah.
And yet, in terms of the brain systems here,
anger's pretty motivating.
Right.
Thinking about the next big moment.
We had this huge depression study that Stephanie Reed and Lisa Duke and I had done, where we were all set to, have the biggest study to date on, depression and EEG asymmetry.
Yeah.
We found nothing.
Nothing.
Dirk Hageman was having similar issues with replicating effects, and we were having issues replicating effects, and we invited John Cacioppo for a colloquium.
Okay.
And I was his host. Talk about good fortune.
Yes.
So I got to spend a few days with John Cacioppo, and
he'd have been very keen to know whether this was not replicating.
He was really interested, and he was the editor of Psychophysiology. And he said, "You've got to write that up."
Do you know about Dirk Hageman's failure to replicate at that time as well?
I think John was the one who turned me on to it. And then I think I didn't meet Dirk until shortly before his article came out, when he was presenting those data. I happened to walk up as Richie's at Dirk's poster. And Dirk is...
Back when we all
Dirk
gave posters.
Unfazed.
Yeah,
and
he's unfazable.
He's just saying, it's not true.
It's not true. Yeah.
And Richie's like, well, but did you do this? And did you do this? And did you do this? And Dirk's like, it's just not there.
Yeah.
But John Cacioppo, I was lamenting to John Cacioppo, was like, I'm a new assistant professor, and I've got these graduate students, and I got them both going down this path, and the data haven't replicated. And I wasn't so much concerned. I hadn't yet been thinking about, oh my God, I won't get tenure, although that was probably in the back of my mind. I was worried about their careers.
Sure.
And John
because
said,
they put a lot of time into it.
A ton of time.
Yeah.
Patient recruitment.
Right. That's not trivial stuff.
Not
Graduate
at all.
students are nervous for a good reason.
So, I said, so what are we going to do with that? John says, you've got to publish it.
Yeah.
And I said, but where? He said, send it to me.
Psychophysiology.
And then he told me about Dirk.
Which, by the way, for people who don't know, if you're publishing a paper like this in Psychophysiology, I mean, especially at that time, this is, for those kinds of data, this is pretty much the top.
Yes,
It was the top sort of intellectually regional journal. This is the top journal.
Yes.
This is the one.
Right. I was honored. I was shocked, but I talked to Stephanie and Delisa, and we got busy and we wrote it up.
Yeah.
And we renamed it at that point once we learned that we could publish it.
Yeah.
Lemons. We were making lemonade.
my
We were
God.
making lemonade out of this because we thought it was a lemon.
I love it.
Yeah. So lemons, that's the data set.
Lemons.
So John worked with us, and then Derek was, an exacting scientist, and he went on to do a lot of good work with asymmetry as well.
So why didn't you kill frontal EEG asymmetry? Why didn't it just come? I'm thinking about, honestly, I don't want to get too far into this, but these days,
why
with
didn't
all
it
the conversation about replicability and all this
Right,
stuff,
right.
this is what came up on that Facebook conversation I was telling you about. I brought up this old failure to replicate, and he's like, he basically insinuated that that's where it should have stopped.
Should have stopped there.
So first of all, why didn't it, and why shouldn't it have?
Why didn't it for me or for the field?
For the field and for you, because I remember now what it was like to be pre-tenure, and you invest a bunch of resources in a thing, and frontal any EEG asymmetry study is a huge pain in the ass.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And it was much more so then.
Right. It's better now that you dump all the data on one drive.
Yeah, but back then you could easily toss 2 years of your life down the drain.
Just to analyze 8 minutes of resting data took 8 hours.
Yeah.
We'd have the sign on the computer. Do not disturb.
I remember. Yeah, you flip the sign down. Yeah, it was the same thing when I was doing peripheral physio with the Gottman lab.
Yeah.
You'd run it overnight.
Right. So I think part of the reason it didn't die was that the idea was still very attractive in people's minds, and especially the framing that Richie had put forth, that it's approach and withdrawal motivation.
Yeah.
This was all very appealing theoretically to people. We were still smack dab in the time when the key question was lateralization, not yet localization, right?
Yeah.
fMRI was just coming on board at that point.
Right.
So that got a lot of people in the field interested. And for me personally, I'd invested a few different studies, including, work with Eddie and so on. And then I kept teaching psychophysiology, and I must have conveyed a certain enthusiasm for this idea, despite my admitted skepticism, that got students interested, and they wanted to do studies.
Yeah.
And so they kept doing studies. And then how was it? You and I got the idea to propose the GEEG study.
Yeah, the big definitive, we were going to solve the whole
definitive
problem.
study.
Well, for me, the thing also was that I had come into graduate school there, and I remember very vividly the conversations about this failure to replicate, because it weighed heavily on my mind, because I thought I was a crazy person to do this some nights. I thought this was a really dumb idea.
Yes.
But I got that NSF grant, and we were
to
doing
do asymmetry
asymmetry with
See,
facial expression.
This is part of it too, that there's like a machine that starts rolling.
I
Right.
gotta do
Jim
this
gets
now.
the NSF grant, and students are interested, and there's these studies going on, and it just keeps on rolling.
Yep,
Right.
it does.
But
and it
I'm with
could've-
you. There were nights where I thought, the next paper I'm going to write will be entitled "Why I No Longer Do EEG Asymmetry
Yep.
Research."
Yep. I have this memory that we were reasonably confident in the state effects.
Yes.
You could get these state effects, but there was the depression, the association with depression, and all of that
and the
stuff.
individual difference variables that were more of a bugaboo. That's right. So you and I really buckled down psychometrically.
We did.
On this.
We did.
And then this coincided with your writing the paper for your comprehensive exam that we got invited to submit that
Right,
chapter.
that
So we said,
chapter.
let's work on
The
this
big review.
paper to, after you do this, we'll work on this paper, we'll
Yeah.
get it in, and then we developed version 2.0 for the special issue
Yep.
in 2004.
Yep.
which we said, well, there's a whole lot here. There's some signal. I think we convinced ourselves that there could be some signal.
Right, because when you
but
did
there's
that
a lot
big
of
review,
mess.
you see so many people. But I was seriously stressed out about the file drawer. It
Yes.
seemed, we didn't have a lot of the, some of the, at least the putative tools that people are developing today to look into that. But I knew about it.
Right.
So we got the grant.
We got the
Too
grant.
late.
Well,
for me.
Yeah, because
I wanted to get the grant. I mean,
we
here's
wrote
the
you
thing.
in as a
Honestly,
postdoc. Right?
And I would say 40%, am I that virtuous? 40% of my motivation was to answer the question.
And the other was tacos and beer in Tucson.
Tacos and beer in Tucson. I was definitely one of those people that was susceptible to SAD in the Midwest and not susceptible to SAD in Tucson. I loved Tucson. Holy
the
shit.
timing was rough because we got the first round of reviews. If we had flown the first time, you would have been in Tucson. You would have been a postdoc.
Been great.
Yep. Although I have to say, probably, especially watching where your career has gone, continuing to do EEG asymmetry work with your graduate advisor would not have put you on the same career path as you have now.
Not saying it would. Just saying I'd had more beer and tacos. That's all I'm saying.
We would have had a good time.
Yeah.
You not being the postdoc meant that, there were all kinds of graduate students who got hired on that project for years.
Yeah.
And then when it was time for a postdoc, we had Dave Towers. Well, he was still, I guess he was ABD.
Yeah.
And then Jenny Stewart.
Yeah.
So, we getting it a little too late so that you couldn't be a paid component of it meant that a lot of other very good people got involved.
Yeah, no, it was great.
Yeah.
It was great. And it wound up being a big, it's a wonderful source of great stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's a data set
for years.
we continue to go back to, as you know.
Yeah.
And it's the perfect data set to answer methodological questions with.
Yep. So I came to Virginia shaken in my boots because I was still really nervous. By the time I started, we hadn't analyzed those. We didn't know the
even
results.
have all those data yet.
Yeah, I was still terrified of EEG asymmetry and EEG in general almost at that point because because to me EEG was so synonymous with EEG asymmetry.
Yes.
But I would say that given what we ultimately found with that study, I feel okay about EEG asymmetry these days.
Yeah.
We have this saying in my lab, and it's only become a saying because I say it so often that my students make fun of me. The phenomenon is real. Because I don't want to go any further unless the thing that happens with the measuring device is itself real.
Right.
And so I'm sort of convinced that EEG asymmetry is real. And that is fascinating to me on so many levels. One, it's gratifying to know that all that time wasn't wasted. But there's this meta-scientific question now that's so pertinent to so many of the discussions, the battles that are happening in science these days. Using some of the heuristics that are now actively in play. I mean, a lot of people, we should have just stopped a long time ago.
These people would say so. Yes.
They would say so, and I think that's
there's not enough
bad idea.
evidence there. Right.
Lee Seacrest had this thing he always used to say. It's you should never let your data interfere too much with your theory.
I learned that from Richard Depew in graduate school.
Is that right?
Yeah.
That used to blow my mind because he was a very empirically minded, sort of cranky methodologist guy, and really what he meant was that often the data is just not good enough, and your theory's better.
And at heart, he's really
your measurement is
he's
the problem.
talking before they were devised of Bayesian statistics significance testing. Right? You've got a whole body of theoretical and empirical data, and one set of new data shouldn't completely overturn that.
Yes,
right. That doesn't change the overall probability.
I still think that as a broad problem in our field, we don't understand theory. We don't know how to talk about theory. We don't know how to train. We don't have a path to generating. But I think that's still something that's lacking. And it was something that I really struggled with and grappled with as a graduate student and since then.
Yeah.
Because frontal EEG asymmetry has had this arc, this narrative arc. It's these troubled times, and then it's really...
But it comes through. But, I guess we could have asked the question back then. Let's say that the current zeitgeist of, questioning the replicability of research were in place, and it were now 1998 when the paper from Derek Hageman came out and the paper that, Reed, Duke, and Allen came out. And so we have 2 published failures to replicate, and yet... there's also a body of research in both infants and adults, both temperament and psychopathology, that says there's some signal there.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean we should just stop cold. It says, okay, the overall probability of this model being true has decreased somewhat. Now, how much has it decreased? It depends on the sample size. It depends on the body of literature that preceded it. I mean, I think it certainly sent shockwaves, into confidence of people like you and me about whether...
And maybe that's the appropriate response, right? The shockwaves are appropriate, giving up not necessarily appropriate, but it becomes a viable option.
Right. I mean, that crisis of confidence motivated people like Derek, along with Ewald Naumann at Trier.
Right.
Ewald plays a huge role in this,
terrific.
actually.
Yeah.
He is a methodological...
He's a powerhouse.
Precision man.
Yeah.
I don't know if he ever met Lee Seacrest, but they would have been on the same page.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Derek went down this pathway of investigating the psychometric properties. We went down the pathway of investigating the psychometric properties, essentially to say, all right, so how much of this could just be due to having a poor measure, and how can we improve this measure in terms of its psychometric properties? And now we have a better sense that it's about 60% trait, but that's a whole lot of variance that, could move around for reasons that we don't fully understand. So we started asking, we backed up from the enticing theoretical approach withdrawal model.
This is what it is.
That's right. Let's approach with our left frontal asymmetry.
Yeah.
to say, hold on.
Are you an approach-oriented person or a withdrawal-oriented person?
Right. Yeah. Did you put that in Cosmopolitan? Yeah.
I don't think that one made it to Cosmo.
So I think that was a good thing for the field.
Yeah.
There was a little bit of questioning, and then we've continued on. What I haven't seen yet, and what I'd like to see, we've now published several papers. As you know, we've done the paper from the GEG study, where when we did that, we found the current source density transformation.
Yeah, that whole thing is super interesting.
I have to credit Derek Hageman was a step ahead on that. He published, the importance of, the problem of reflected alpha, also back when he talked about the replication failures. And, we kind of came a little later to the game, but... in our 2010 paper with Jenny, we found the CSD effects, and then every paper we've looked at after that with different tests, different tasks, different models, we continue to use CSD, and it seems like a fairly robust effect.
And now I feel like you more than anyone. I mean, I know that there are many more people now doing it than I was first starting to do this research with you, and certainly when you were first starting to, it's all over the place. I can't keep up with the literature very easily. I'm going to try.
That's a common problem in our field, in the scientific field generally, with the proliferation of journals. Yeah.
But the main thing is that since the narrative arc with the measure has become recently so satisfying to me, because now it's really less about is it a thing, is the phenomenon real, and more about what's causing
it,
the
phenomenon.
How do we pack it apart? What does it really mean in terms of when you take it from the neurophysiological to the psychological levels? And these are wonderful questions, because you don't have that sort of dark, horrible doubt about whether any of those other questions are even worth asking.
Right.
Now I think we've crossed that threshold, and that's something for psychophysiology.
It is.
That's a big deal.
Yeah. But you remind me, I'd given many professional talks, but until my presidential address for SPR in 2009, I'd never given an EEG asymmetry-based, full-length, colloquium-length talk.
Really?
I'd only given short conference presentation kinds of talks. And it's because when I had talks to give, I thought about, what do I feel most confident about telling the story for? Because, giving a talk, you can review the research, and at those earlier junctions, I could say, there's a few questions here, and we did some methodological work, and we investigated reliability, but I didn't have an answer.
Yeah.
And of course, you never have the answer, but
right.
I didn't have enough of an answer to know what to tell people in a big talk like that.
Oh, man.
And what I encouraged them at the end of the talk in 2009, it was through the metaphor of time and space, which always works well, was to join me in a more precise temporal and spatial examination of frontal EEG asymmetry.
What I've been calling the narrative arc.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great, because there is really a story here. And I love the measure, not only just for what it is, but for that story. There's a much broader scientific story. There's pedagogy built into this story.
When you think about the kinds of signal that astronomers are able to discern, and it's based on theory, there's a whole bunch of noise, and they've got a tiny signal.
Yeah.
and they make sense of it. And I think asymmetry is the same way. We didn't have quite the right theory, and I don't think we still do, to know exactly what that signal is we're looking for.
Yeah.
But there's a signal there, and it keeps emerging strongly enough.
We're hacking away at it.
Right?
Yeah.
And hopefully the right manipulations and the right methodological approaches will hone in on what that signal is. And I think a big piece of that is triangulating using other methodologies to try to say, okay, this exists in the EEG frequency domain of alpha world.
Yeah.
Does it exist in the bold signal world?
Right.
Does it exist in the time frequency domain?
Well, man, I tell you what, you guys are really leading the way in my estimation. Everybody should be watching you for this kind of stuff. You're not shy about doing things that are outside the comfort zone of a lot of people. You know, like the acupuncture study, for example. But you don't compromise your methodological values at any step. It's a perfect combination.
And I have to say, this is what has attracted me to psychophysiology from the get-go. It's the way to take an exacting operationalization of something that seems a bit ethereal.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And you get to study funky, interesting things
Amen
in
to
a way
that.
that's careful.
You got
Yeah.
it. All right, man. Well, thanks
Hey,
for
this is a lot of fun.
Was this fun?
This was
good.
fun.
I enjoyed this too.
It's a little like click and clack.
I know. Kick and clack the EEG Asymmetry brothers. All right.
You know, at least from the outside, scientific research seems like something that not only takes accuracy, but anxiety. There's a real fear of being wrong. There's a lot of pressure to make sure that the scope of your research is going to yield positive results.
There is that pressure. And it's kind of unfortunate because the pressure really comes from kind of the economics of how science is done. The competition for grants and grant funding that has steadily declined over the last several decades to the point where, you know, it's like a mad scramble to get all these things. But at the same time, you're working in a space that is, by definition, devoid of clear answers. That's why you're doing the work. So you are wandering around in the dark, trying to persuade funding agencies that this particular dark room is the one they should be letting you wander around in.
Well, it seems really unfortunate because you can learn a lot from a negative result. You know, if something totally doesn't work, that's not to say that you aren't learning tons of stuff through that.
Unquestionably. In fact, there's a saying, when you've gotten a positive result, you've basically just added a new piece of data to your data set.
Right.
But when you get a negative result, you've made a discovery. So there's a very real sense in which negative results or failed hypotheses, that's the real stuff. That's where real progress happens. The problem is that it feels crummy.
Well,
it
opens up so many more questions, which is intimidating.
That's right. And it also, and I can't emphasize this enough, makes you feel like an idiot for a little bit of time. You know, when some of the failed hypotheses that I've made have made me feel so dumb that I've felt like I needed to just quit. You know, you got to build up some calluses.
Right. And there's a lot of scientific ideas that when they're first introduced are looked at as ridiculous by other people in the field. We'll hear a little bit about that in our next episode in 2 weeks, where you have Peter Sterling on. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Peter Sterling is one of the world's great neuroscientists. A lot of what we know about the neuroscience of the eye, for example, comes from his original laboratory work at the University of Pennsylvania. But Peter Sterling has also got this fascinating personal story of political activism and engagement in communities that has found its way into the science that he does in ways that are truly unique. And he has been able to integrate so many different fields to understand some of the problems that we all see right in front of our noses every day in our communities, in our country, in ways that other scientists can only sort of scratch their heads and marvel at, including me. Almost nobody has been more influential on my own work than Peter Sterling.
Sounds great.
Folks, the music of Circle of Willis is written and performed by Tom Stauffer and his band, The New Drakes. For more information on how to purchase their music on our website, go to circleofwillispodcast.com.
You can also find all of the older episodes on the website. If you haven't already, subscribe to Circle of Willis wherever you get your podcasts, and follow us on Twitter and Instagram for more updates.
Circle of Willis, human stories of the science that shapes our world.